to Sarmaya Talks at Sarmaya for the very first time. Thank you all so much for being here. Just a little bit before we get started, I wanted to tell you about Sarmaya itself and the new space that we're sitting in. So, as many of you may know, Paul is a great collector. His collection comes from his great love of the artifacts that he collects. In terms of how this archive has been created, you can see that many of the artifacts here were collected not because Paul knew that one day he was going to create a museum, but because he had a genuine passion for them. It is that same genuine passion that he wanted to share with us today. When Paul first got the idea to start Sarmaya 10 years ago, in memory of Tina, he began a long journey. That journey has achieved its culmination in the space that we are sitting in. When he met my mother 8 years ago, Sarmaya was a digital museum, and it did not have a physical space. For a long time, they found space where they could to put on events like this and share their love with the world. Today, we are sitting in a space that has been created with that same love, and not just preserved, but restored for all of our benefit. Once again, I want to thank you all for being here.
Okay, I'm going to take exactly 2 minutes to introduce Manu. Manu is an old friend of Sarmaya. We are delighted that he keeps coming back to us here. This is his third outing at Sarmaya. And I remember we started way back. This sort of session used to happen at my home. And Manu was one of the first speakers who came home at that time with his inaugural book, Ivory Throne. And since then, of course, Manu has put out so many publications and become one of the leading lights of the Indian literary scene. And I must say that each time he outdoes himself with every new book that he puts his heart and soul into. I mean, I was looking at that book, the amount of references and notes that are there, a testament to the hard work he puts into each of his publications. So, really delighted to have you here, Manu. Just a quick background to Manu. Manu is a winner of the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. He holds a PhD in history from King's College in London and has been writing in several national publications of the last 10 years. His other books are, of course, The Ivory Throne, which he brought out in 2015, Rebel Sultans in 2018, The Courtesan, the Mahatma the Italian Brahmin in 2019, and False Allies in 2021, and now the latest, which he will, talk about. I think that we are so happy that we have this place, and I'll be remiss if I don't formally thank my wife Pavitra for bringing this place to life. If you had seen what we got, this was occupied by one of the banks for 30 or 35 years, and they made it their mission to run it to the ground. So we really had to, kind of work real hard to, and like she said, all this was painted over. It took 2 months to actually scrape off the paint and expose the teak, and we decided to keep it with the natural finish. Just a little bit about what we will expect to do out of this space. We have a library of over 15,000 books, not all of which are here. Most of you, we do get students, we do get researchers and budding authors who come to kind of, refer to some of these really beautiful and very rare books. But there are other categories. There are 7 genres in the collection, and if people want to see that, please do get in touch with our team, and we can organize small groups and do show and tell, take you through some of the really beautiful objects that we have in the collection. So, welcome once again to this inaugural Sarmaya talk. We are really pleased to finally be able to do this in a space we call our own. Thank you very much, and Manu, floor is yours.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you Paul, Pavitra and the rest of the team at Sarmaya. As Paul said, my first talk at Sarmaya was 8 years ago, which feels like a lifetime ago now. Even then, although this is a very beautiful hall, in Paul's drawing room, which was also a very beautiful hall, full of art, full of pictures, and a wonderful view of the Arabian Sea. And I'm glad they've not only recreated that sense of beauty here, but just packed it with amazing books and coins and artifacts and antiques in this room. So it's always wonderful to talk history in a place that has so much history and is sort of alive with that sense as well. Thank you for being here. I believe I have 40 minutes to speak. Madhav, once I'm around 30, just give me some kind of a clue. I'll look vaguely in your direction, raise your hand. With that, I will begin. This is my first talk for this new book, my 5th book. And I'm glad the applause came now, because for the longest time I was paranoid I'd get cancelled for this book. So maybe at the end of this talk there won't be applause, we'll see. But being the first talk, if there are any hiccups, I hope you'll forgive me. Now I'll begin with the title of the book itself, Gods, Guns and Missionaries, the making of the modern Hindu identity. There was someone who asked me right at the beginning, what do guns and gods, and gods perhaps, but what do guns and missionaries have to do with Hinduism or the Hindu identity in the 21st century? And I thought therefore I'll just explain what the title signifies as far as I'm concerned. Now the word gods in the title obviously refers to divinity, but being human beings, we are very inconsistent as a species. We have different ideas. If you ask people here in this room, their own notions of God will be very different. Is it one God? Is it 3 gods? Is it 1,000,000 gods? Is it hundreds of gods? Do you worship God as some kind of abstract entity up there in the skies, or do you worship God in a sort of humanized form, Shiva or Vishnu or Parvati or whatever it is that you personally prefer? So there are debates around the idea of God itself, and where Hindus come in contact with religions from other parts of the world, especially Christianity in the colonial period, and a kind of evangelical Christianity, these debates around God were a very critical element in that dialogue, in that interaction. The second part of the title is guns. And guns signifies, at one level of course, revolutionary resistance to the British, because they did throw bombs and shoot with guns at the British. But really it is a placeholder for colonialism itself, as this phenomenon that we had to live with as a people. So guns signifies the presence of the British, but it's also not a simple black and white tale. It isn't the case that the British came here and they shot at us with their guns and we just sort of got oppressed from that moment and that was the beginning of colonialism. It's actually a less black and white, much more complicated, much more nuanced story. And later in the presentation, I'll talk about some of the flip-flops that we see in colonialism. But that colonialism is also, the colonial encounter and experience is also very critical to understanding how modern Hinduism took form in the 18th, 19th, and ultimately the 20th centuries. And the final element is, of course, missionaries. Again, they're not one substance or one commodity. Different missionaries, Catholics behaved in a certain way, Protestant missionaries behaved in a certain way. Missionaries in the 17th century behaved one way, missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries had a very different way of engaging with Hindu society. So again, looking at a whole spectrum of people, but broadly clubbed under the idea of missionaries. And people who came here genuinely convinced, and this is one thing I must stress, which is that this is, although there are awkward elements in history, there are moments of violence, there are moments of disputes and quarrels. None of this is to sort of point fingers or blame people, it is just to understand things in their context. And in that context, a lot of missionaries came here because they were genuinely convinced that they had a path to God, and it was their duty to take this out into the world and open up that path to people of other religions, who in their mind were lost and under the power of Satan, etc. Speaking of Satan, so the image on the left here is, you'll find various old European texts which refer to this god in India, or devil as they call it, called Diomo or Diomus. And it's quite funny as a Malayali, because at some point a European traveller happened to pass through Kerala and heard the word Devam, which basically means Deva or God in Malayalam, and decided that of course these are pagans, of course these are idolaters, they worship idols, they don't have real gods. If you're worshipping idols, etc., you have no access to real gods, you're actually worshipping Satan. So Devam became Diomo or Diomus, and Diomus was called the devil of Calicut. Now, if you go to Calicut, you'll actually see a Shiva temple there, and Shiva looks nothing like this character here with fangs and cock's feet and these strange fingernails and all of that. But this was very much the picture that a lot of Europeans had when they came into India. And with good reasons. Even as Christianity spread into Europe originally back in the day, several centuries before this encounter with India, Europe itself was pagan. Europe itself had people worshipping trees, sacrificing human beings, sacrificing animals, a whole different polytheistic ecosystem. And in their mind, in the original Christian conception, these were all satanic forces. So you have stories about these Christian priests back in the day in Europe, where they go and they sort of break an idol and they say that these strange creatures spring out of the idol, these dark, evil forms emerge from the idol and sort of vanish into thin air. They think that it is Satan's agents who are worshipped as stone gods and as idols by the misled people. So they're already coming from a culture in Europe where they think that anything you worship in an idol has to be satanic. And so when they come to India, they see something like Narasimha, the other image, and obviously they're scandalized. You have this man with a rather strange appearance, apparently emerging from a pillar, ripping open another human being. How can this be God? God, in their view, in the biblical sense, has certain attributes that they're familiar with. This surely can't be God. So there is a cultural dissonance there. For the early Europeans coming into India, there is a sense that something is off. These people are devil-worshipping pagans. Now, it doesn't matter really, because it's not as if people in India cared very much what Europeans thought about their religion, because there wasn't much interface back in the day. What complicates the situation is power. When European power begins to grow in India, originally in Goa. So the first chapter of the book has a chunk which is set in Goa. And you have in Goa the Portuguese coming in. And with the Portuguese coming in, not long after, you also find Jesuits and Franciscans and a bunch of other missionary fathers appearing in Goa. And these old stereotypes that exist start having very real life consequences. And these stereotypes are pretty hilarious. For example, there was this assumption that everywhere in India, all Hindu women were being burned as satis. And of course, that was an exaggeration. Sati did exist, but it existed among certain classes of people and certain geographies. It wasn't a pan-Indian custom at any point. We know this because there's this one traveler who, and these stereotypes, they recycle themselves. So one person will popularize a stereotype. The next traveler will repeat the stereotype in order to sound authentic to people back home, saying, look, I also went and saw all this. So you're also trying to titillate your audience. You're also trying to entertain your audience, because your audience reading this in Europe has no idea as to what is actually happening in India. So you have this one character passing again through Kerala who says that he saw Sati in Kerala, which is a very strange thing, because Kerala is one part of India where Sati was actually outlawed. Traditionally, you couldn't commit Sati in Kerala, because most of the upper caste communities are matrilineal, so you could have multiple husbands. So if you have 3 husbands or 2 husbands or whatever, it doesn't matter if your husband dies, you can take another. That was the custom that existed in matrilineal communities, including mine. My great-great-grandmother had 2. But even among the Brahmins of Kerala, the Nambuthiris, they have what is called 64 anacharams, which Parashurama is supposed to have given them, which explicitly says no sati permitted. So traditionally, there is no question of sati having occurred among Malayalis in this period, in the late medieval period. But because these stereotypes existed, it was mentioned. It's quite funny, because as late as the 19th century, there was an immigrant, I think a Tamil lady who came to Kerala, and her husband happened to pop. And she said, I'm a good wife, now I must commit sati. And the Rani of Travancore said, no, because it isn't allowed in our territory. So I'm happy to escort you to Tamil Nadu. You can go there and burn yourself, but you can't burn yourself in Kerala. So that is the reality, and this is the stereotype. Now, then, of course, these missionaries are also coming in, and in Goa, there is this confluence between power and the missionary agenda. Again, when you look at colonialism, when you look at what's happening in India, you can't not look at what was happening in Europe as well. One of the initially when the Portuguese came into Goa, for the first few decades, they were quite okay with Hindu practices. They were quite accommodative of local religions, and they didn't have much of a problem. But it is events in Europe that partly end up triggering aggressive, a kind of militant attitude in Goa. The reason being that in Europe you had the Catholic Church, and then as some of you might know, there was the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestants accused the Catholics of corrupting Christianity. The Protestants said that you've sort of buried Christianity under all these rituals, under rites. You've actually turned Christianity into a form of idolatry. You've actually corrupted God's word. You're not even giving access to the Bible to the ordinary peasant, to the ordinary people in the street. Everything is masked in Latin. So the Protestant Reformation was beginning, and the Catholic Church was under siege. Now, when you're under siege, you also have to show off that you are in fact good Christians, because suddenly there's someone pointing fingers and saying that you're not even actually Christians. And conveniently, being in Goa helped, because here you had a parade ground of so-called pagans and idolaters. And in a sense, persecuting them and showing off that you were in fact good, committed Christians, going after the idolaters, going after the pagans, made their Christianity look more authentic to people, because back home there was all these issues with Protestants. So again, what's happening in India isn't happening in isolation, it's happening as a consequence of what's underway in Europe as well, between the Catholics and the Protestants. And this divide will continue to play out in India subsequently. So in Goa, you find initially, for the first time, Hindus being persecuted by Christian power. Not Christianity, but Christian power. Where power thinks of itself as motivated and supported by a religious mission and justifying itself in the form of a religious mission. So you have things like gods have to go into exile because temples are being broken, and so you have various gods going away to other places outside Goa. People's habits are suspect. So if you squat and urinate, that's no longer allowed. You can't leave your slippers at the door when you enter, because the European custom is that you can wear your slippers inside the house. Local music is outlawed. Local cultural practices are outlawed. All of this is happening because there is a group of very stern missionaries supporting the state, and the state is also supporting the missionaries by giving them access to state apparatus and might. So it is in this context that you see a kind of defensive identity originally taking form among Hindus, because when you're persecuted, your identity takes form. If you look at Hinduism originally, it's a very fluid system. There's all kinds of traditions, everything from a tribal god to a Sanskritic god. There are gods for whom you'll give palabhishekam with milk and honey and flowers. Other gods, you give them alcohol and blood and sacrifice goats to them. There's a whole spectrum of practices that's permitted. And you could even argue that this is very fluid, and people had no reason, therefore, to think of themselves as one homogenized group. Even today, I don't think most Hindus recognize themselves as one homogenized group. The practices we have in Kerala are very different from the practices in, say, Uttar Pradesh. The way temples are structured and so on. There are lots of differences and nuances. But when you're targeted as a group, you end up awakening to a sense of identity. And this is where power becomes important, because it was that sense of persecution that leads to this dynamic emerging in Goa. And later under the British, this happens at a much more, at a vaster sort of scale in terms of geography across different parts of India. But persecution only works when you actually have control of the state. And Goa was still a relatively small, enclave. Even in Goa, there were people who found ways to resist. So you would have to exile your gods, but you would take your god across the frontier into neighboring territory and build an even bigger temple. If people were being forced to convert in Goa, the Brahmins devised ways to reconvert them. What perhaps now people call Ghar Vapsi, a format of that back in the day. But they'd say you could go take a bath in the sea, or you could go purify yourself with Ganga water, and you could be brought back into the Hindu fold. So there were ways in which people were resisting, and eventually, of course, the Goan authorities also realized this, and they toned down the persecution after a few generations. But it leads to lasting changes. You do see a demographic change in Goa. There's a figure at one point about how in the early 16th century, I think there were some 80,000 Hindus in Goa and only a few thousand Christians. But a century later it flips. You have about 100,000 Christians and only 3,000 or so non-Christians left in Goa. So a lot of present day Hindutva's anxieties about demographic change, if you look at it, the way they connect history is to these experiences, and it is from this that the paranoia emerges. These historical fears and processes do not come out of thin air. somewhere there is a way someone is reading history to justify these anxieties even in the present. And perhaps there is some validity because there is some fear that was visible in Goa. Now, in Goa, of course, this was happening, but elsewhere, missionaries were coming into contact with local Hindu rajas. And here, state power was not in the hands of Christians, so you were under Hindu rulers. And under Hindu rulers, obviously, you couldn't go around persecuting or forcing people to convert. You had to persuade. And persuasion was an interesting process. You find, for example, again in Calicut, a missionary debating the Brahmins at the court of the Zamarin of Calicut. And he's done his homework. He says, your gods are all unbelievably silly. You have Krishna running around with the gopis. Is this, how can you call this person God? Such an ill-behaved character, romancing all these women, many of them married. Not acceptable. Then they say there's Ganapati, has the head of an elephant, this prodigious belly, but somehow manages to move around on a rat. How is this even a god? So there's a sense, so the fathers are doing their homework. They're making sense of what Hindu Puranas say, etc. Some of it is very garbled. There is this one rather amusing story where they say that Shiva had a lady attached on his back, and he said Om, which wasn't a sacred syllable, but do you desire? And the lady said which means yes, I desire. So then he has to get the lady off his back. When they do that, they discover this is a missionary rendition of some Puranic story that they've completely understood in a convoluted way. Then they discover that Shiva has a ginormous penis which cannot be used for procreation. And the penis has to then be cut into pieces. Then they discover that, the lady off the back doesn't have genitals herself, so the genitals have to be created. And from the blood emerge all kinds of rivers and natural phenomena. And while Shiva's penis is used to sort of create geographical things like the mountains and the valleys and things like that. Very garbled, very strange. But this gentleman in Calicut certainly did his homework and he did understand what Krishna and Ganapati were all about. But it's not as if his audience was just struck by it either. The Zamarin of Calicut said, great, you've done your homework, very impressive. But let me also ask you some counter questions. For example, you're saying that Jesus was divine. But if Jesus was divine, how was he put up on a cross and killed by the Jews? And this is again a quote, he's saying. But there was a counter question. Then they said that, you have issues with us worshipping God through idols. What about the processions you bring out for the Virgin Mary? Isn't that a form of idolatry? So already you see that in Goa you might have control of the state and therefore a sense of persecution. Here there's a degree of pushback because here you are working out as equals. It's under Hindu Rajas and their courts that these debates are taking place. Even in the Mughal court you have some of these debates taking place. And it's an equation of equals, relative equals here. Also these Hindu Rajas aren't terribly pleased with some of the Jesuit priests because a lot of them are also embroiled in Portuguese politics. So you actually have one Jesuit priest who writes a book in which he details all kinds of places in South Kerala. So he says, such and such a temple has so much treasure, such and such a mosque can be attacked from the ship. Another place you'll have to get down and then go and burn down the mosque or the temple. And he luckily tells them where exactly they can disembark from their ships. So there is a sense that the Jesuits are also embroiled in Portuguese politics. So there's some suspicion in the Hindu courts. But there are also other Jesuits. The gentleman you see in this image is a rather colourful man called Roberto de Nobili, who came off from Italy. If you read my third book, there's a small essay on this gentleman in that book. He comes off very noble stock in Italy, not Portuguese and therefore not particularly committed to the Portuguese political mission. He's here to convert people to Christianity because he genuinely believes it. He comes down to India, goes off to Madurai, and in Madurai he discovers that again, this is an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire. There's a great temple here. It's a fabulous city in South India, massive palace and all of that. It's not going to be easy to convert people here. And remember, just as white people had stereotypes about Indians, that they were burning women and throwing babies to crocodiles in rivers, etc., Indians also had stereotypes about white people. So the brown man also thought that white people like to eat children fried in butter. Even Emperor Shah Jahan once complained that these white people are very uncivilized and barbaric because they go to the toilet and don't wash their bottoms. So Indians had a sense also that white people were not quite as fancy as they pretended to be. And in a place like Madurai, a major temple town, a major royal city, being a white man wasn't a cool thing. People thought he was a mere parangi. Parangi, which comes originally from Frank or Firangi, the Persian term, was applied for all Europeans and it was considered a bad word. A Parangi was a non-bottom washing unclean, alcohol drinking kind of figure. So Roberto Nobili realizes that if I am to persuade people to think of Christianity as a serious religion in a place like Madurai, it can no longer be seen as the Parangi Veda or the Veda of the Parangis. It has to be seen as something else. So he rebrands both Christianity and himself. So Christianity now becomes not the Parangi Veda but the Satya Veda, the Veda of truth. And he essentially says that the Bible is like your fifth Veda. You have your Indian Vedas, but this is a superior Veda. This is the one that will actually bring you salvation. He goes vegetarian. He acquires a sacred thread like a Brahmin, learns Sanskrit, starts dressing in saffron, starts squatting on the floor to eat, eats out of plantain leaves, eats only vegetarian food. Even when he goes to Goa to meet his own superiors, he takes a Brahmin cook. And he doesn't eat with his own superiors because he says, you are all Parangis. I am now an Italian Brahmin. So I am a lost tribe of Roman Brahmins. And he essentially tries to woo Brahmins and upper caste Hindus in Madurai, saying that, okay, by now also there's study of Hinduism, in the sense that earlier people came with stereotypes. Earlier people came with a fixed sense of, oh, these are devil-worshipping pagans. But these devil-worshipping pagans were not converting. You were bringing the light of the Bible to them, but the pagans showed no interest in converting. So then there was a desire to study what the pagan theology was, what their religion was. And as they studied, they started discovering that, okay, there is something of value in Hinduism. We don't understand the temples, we don't understand the pujas, we don't understand gods that want blood sacrifices. But if you look at the philosophical ideas, there are things that correlate with what Christianity also teaches. The idea of a supreme God who's omnipotent, all-seeing, abstract, etc., etc. So there is some study. So then people like Roberto Nobili, their argument is that yes, you are a step. Hinduism is a step on the ladder to God, but it's a lower step. Christianity is the higher step. Christianity is like pure milk. Hinduism is milk mixed with poison. So now it becomes a slightly relative argument. So from absolute disdain and contempt, which is born out of lack of exposure, exposure brings about a degree of doubt in the mind of these Jesuits as well. But at the same time, a desire to understand Hinduism and then debunk it. And Roberto Nobili essentially does something like that. He does have some success in Madurai, not as many Brahmins as he would have liked, but he does get a bunch of upper caste people, thousands of them. And remember here that just as Hinduism has multiple forms, it's not as if Islam and Christianity don't. As these religions spread into different cultures, they also assumed local cultural attributes and were not a unified, homogeneous kind of tradition. So the Christianity Roberto Nobili sold in Tamil Nadu actually allows caste. You could come and become a Christian and bring your caste with you. So in his church, the Brahmin sat in the front, the lower caste convert sat on the floor or sat in the back. There was a difference. He would not eat food cooked by a lower caste Christian. As late as the 19th century, you have Catholic priests where they would go into, say, a village of Parayars, which is a marginalized community in Tamil Nadu, and keep them at the door of the church. And even a few years ago, I have a citation in my book of a news article, I think, from the Times of India, where Dalit Christians in South India were complaining that they still had separate cemeteries, they were still not allowed to participate in the church rites, etc., because Christianity absorbs a lot of local qualities in making itself palatable to Hindus. As I said, they thought this was the Parangi Vedam of bad white people who did bad, horrible things and drank alcohol. So in order to make it acceptable, people like Roberto Nobili gave it value, but gave it value in the sense Hindus understood value. So upper caste practices, so-called ritualistically clean practices, upper caste groups, upper caste converts, that kind of emphasis. Then you have, of course, rivalries within Christianity. As I said, it's not as if the Christians were one uniform block. The gentleman you see in this other unhappy looking gentleman in the black robe is a unhappy missionary called Ziegenbach, Bartholomew Ziegenbach. He was the first Protestant missionary to come to India. Now you would imagine that the missionaries would be happy with more missionaries coming, but the Catholics were not happy with the Protestants coming, because they thought the Protestants were now selling a perverted version of Christianity. They said they had proper Christianity, the Protestants said that they had authentic Christianity, and the two couldn't agree. And Hindu converts were also very clever. Some would convert to go after the Jesuits and convert, hoping to get certain benefits. When they didn't get it, they'd say, oh, we're now going after the Protestants because they're offering us a better deal. So the converts also knew how to play these different groups of Christian missionaries off each other. But Ziegenbach also comes here in the early 18th century. So by now we've reached the 1700s. And by now there's greater knowledge of of Hinduism. Various Jesuits have been writing about Hinduism. They have a sense of temple culture. They have a sense that there are these scriptures called the Vedas, the Upanishads, that there is some kind of philosophical core around which the Hindu system operates and so on. And Ziegenbalg, even though when he first comes, he's convinced that he's coming into a culture of barbarians, terrible, terrible people who have no sense of civilization. Within a few weeks and months of being here, he realizes that he's completely off. And he writes back to his superiors saying that, these people are not as misled and lost as I thought. They are actually cultured. They do have their own sense of ethics which matches ours. And he starts reading and learning. Within a few years, he has very few converts, but he collects about 600 manuscripts of local Tamil texts, the Tirukural, the Tolkappiyam, all of these Tamil texts. And he starts comparing this to European literature. So he says that just as in Europe we value the teachings of Aristotle, here they read the Tirukural. So he's trying to use a Western framework and slot these Indian texts that he's finding into that Western framework to correlate their value. But he also goes further. He goes and writes a book called The Genealogy of the South Indian Gods, where he actually looks at everything from the village goddess of smallpox to this abstract god right on top and creates a sort of family tree. So their Shiva, Parvati, their kids and their consorts, all of this is included in this family tree. But the subtext is, after a few years of work, he's still committed as a Christian, yet he has a degree of self-doubt. In his writings, you get the sense that he feels that, okay, these people have something already. How do I then make my message palatable to them? And remember, he's also debating local Hindus. Sometimes in an irritating way. For example, he'll land up in front of a temple in Trankaba on a horse. And usually even nobility would get off the horse because you're in God's presence. So you would not trot about on a horse, but he will defiantly do that. So in that sense, he would irritate some people. But he also engaged in a lot of correspondence with local Brahmins and non-Brahmin religious experts. And this was conducted through letters. And we have these translated letters now available, and it's quite fascinating. The same debates, the same sort of arguments that Hindus were making with the Catholic missionaries get repeated here. The Hindu perspective is quite simple. They tell Ziegenbalg, they tell Nobili, they tell all the earlier Jesuits who've also come, that we are not denying that Christianity is a way to God. Jesus sounds like he was a wonderful person. He was definitely somebody to look up to, and your religion has value, but it has value for you. And essentially, one of the analogies somebody gives is that God is like a shopkeeper. In order to bring different customers to his counter, he has a different set of products. Similarly, when Christian missionaries would claim that the Bible was the only way to reach God, the Hindus responding to Ziegenbalg would say, but if the Bible was the only way to reach God, why didn't God give it to everybody? If God is truly omnipotent, universal, all-seeing and all-loving, he would have given everybody the same scripture, but he didn't. Instead, he had Jesus appear in your culture as his son, just as Vishnu took 10 avatars here for us. So the logic was good for you, but for us, we have our own path. Another traveler called Francois Bernier, he comes across a bunch of Brahmins doing their morning sandhya in water. And he says, this can't have been mandated by God or a real God. This has to be satanic, because if you perform these rituals in Europe is so cold, you'd all freeze to death. And despite his blinding display of logic, his interlocutors were not disarmed. They said, we are only doing this in our culture. God has told us to do this here in our tropical climate with water. In your climate, you can do other things. God has again got multiple ways to heaven. And this point of multiple ways to heaven as opposed to one way to heaven, multiple paths to understanding God as opposed to one path to understanding God, this recurs across centuries. Across centuries, you hear people repeating this argument in different parts of the country. So clearly there was some sense of intellectual understanding that this is how you pose or mount a defense of Hinduism when faced with certain questions. In fact, as late as the early 20th century, when Bal Gangadhar Tilak tries to define the term Hindutva, this is one of the conditions. He says in order to be a Hindu, you have to believe in multiple paths to God. It cannot just be one path, there are always multiple paths to God. But all of this is still happening in an academic setting, in the sense that European power in India is still very limited. There's some Goa here, there's a few enclaves here and there, but broadly most of India is still under Indian rule. What really turns these academic debates into a more fraught, a more complicated, unhappy encounter is again power. Just as in Goa, power came into the equation, on a pan-Indian scale now, power comes into the equation with the rise of the British. Now here again, I love this image because it actually shows a Brahmin priest blessing the flag of the English East India Company. Because in the initial stage, both parties were more than happy to flirt with each other. So when Puri was conquered by the East India Company army in the early 19th century, the Brahmins of Puri actually wrote a Sanskrit letter to the British Governor General saying, till you came, we were suffering under our Hindu rulers, the Marathas actually. And you are now our salvation. You've come and liberated us from our chains and so on. This is actually local priests in Puri writing to the white man. The British also in this time are very accommodative of Hindus because they are new in India. They've got their territory, but they are very, very stressed as to whether they'll be able to hold on to this territory. You're in an alien country, you're in an alien culture, you want to retain power, but you can only retain power if you keep the people on your side. You can't annoy them in any serious way. So, in this early generation of Englishmen, you actually have people saying that go ahead, smash coconuts at Hindu temples. There are Englishmen going and making donations, whether it's Tirupati, where Thomas Munro makes a donation, Madurai, where Roose Peter goes and donates jewelry, Padmanabha Swami in Trivandrum, where Colonel Munro gives a silver umbrella with pearls and emeralds and all of that. There are actual officials going out and performing Hindu rituals, escorting, East India Company troops are escorting Hindu gods during processions. Donations and endowments are being made by the British for Hindu temples because they see it as a pragmatic policy. They think of it as, look, we're in a country of foreign people. If we want to continue being rulers, we have to rule on their terms. Therefore, we're going to not upset them. There's also a fear that if they intervene in the religion of the Hindus, their own soldiers are Hindus. So if the soldiers begin to get upset, then British power would collapse because your own army would turn against you. Which is why you would rather get a Hindu priest to come and bless your flag so that the rest of your brown soldiers can see it and appreciate it as opposed to taking a very hard-line position. So colonialism begins in that sense. But soon after, it also flips because, I'll actually go to, where is this? It actually flips because, again, we go back now to Europe because as I said earlier, it's not just what's happening here, it's what's happening there. By the late 18th century, early 19th century in Europe, you have this situation where the Enlightenment has happened and it's been promoting a sense of rationalism and religion itself as a concept is under attack. So there's a backlash to that. You have the Industrial Revolution, which unleashes all kinds of new social dynamics in British society. There's a new middle class forming, old power structures are collapsing. In this, there's a churn taking place in British society as well. And in this churn, there is a growth of religiosity. I often give the example of how in Kerala, after the Gulf boom, all the Malayalis went to the Gulf and started making money. And Kerala has a strong communist culture and rationalism and reading Russian literature and all of that. Except that the Gulf money that was being made was poured back into Kerala where people started building big houses, often in garish colors, but also temples. They started patronizing their own religions. They started falling back on tradition. Because when people get social mobility, when people get a sense of money, they also want a sense of self-worth, and that comes from falling back on familiar cultural codes. Essentially something like that happened in Britain in this period, where there was a newfound religiosity. And it was no longer religiosity by church fathers or churchmen, it was happening at the level of civil society. In fact, in British society itself, there was now criticism that every cobbler thought that he had a right to go and become a missionary. Every carpenter thought he could sail overseas to India and civilize the natives. Not allowed because power structures are being broken down. In this new evangelical climate, there was now a desire to civilize the natives. A desire, a feeling that God had given India to the British to civilize, and therefore the British had a duty to go out there and spread Christianity. So that's when colonialism again flips from that accommodative situation where coconuts are being smashed at temples. You now have a situation into the 19th century where British officials stop smashing those coconuts. They stop escorting those Hindu deities. They stop patronizing temples. And actually colonial policy starts showing a sign of evangelicalism. By the time of the notorious Lord Dalhousie, who was one of the viceroys, he was a known evangelical. When Duleep Singh of Punjab converted to Christianity, he was extremely thrilled. And he thought that it was the first of many Indian princes who would hopefully follow and also convert to Christianity. So you see a transition. Where earlier governors general were very, very careful, very, very respectful of local sentiments. As time passed, later governors general and officials become much more aggressive. They become much more pointed in their Christianity, and it culminates in what is called one of the triggers behind the Great Rebellion of 1857. But while this is happening, there's something else also happening. The man with the, well, they both have curls, but the man without the hat is a man called William Jones. So in that time when the British were still trying to cozy up to Hindu society, there was a desire to understand the riches and the treasures of ancient Hindu, the Brahmins and our scriptures and so on. And William Jones was one of those people. He translates Shakuntala into English and it becomes this great sensation in Europe. They're studying the Puranas, they start studying the Vedas, translations are being made. And there is now a feeling that, okay, Hindu society in the present is corrupted. What you see with polytheism, with the idols, with the temples, with the sacrifices, all of that is degradation. But ancient Hindu society was at a higher level. It was a more philosophically, spiritually inclined kind of society. This narrative that we were somehow great spiritual people back in the day, and that's all we did, like some kind of mecca of spirituality in the world, partly comes out of these Orientalist stereotypes that emerge in this period in the 18th century. The other gentleman you see is Warren Hastings, the slightly judgmental looking man in the hat. Poor chap tried very hard to rule Hindus on their own terms and got impeached for it later in Britain. But he's the man who first sponsored a translation of the Gita. Because these people, this generation of Englishmen did not want missionaries coming into British India. For years and years and years, they resisted missionary activity. These are white men resisting other white men from coming because they do not want to upset local religious sentiments. So Warren Hastings gets the Gita translated into English. And when he does it, his idea is twofold. One is to show to people in England that look, the Gita has such wonderful ideas and such wonderful teachings. The natives do not need to be civilized or taught. They have in their own traditions lofty ideas and we will rule them on the basis of their own culture. But it is also to show Indians that look, we value your sacred scriptures. That's why we are translating it. That's why we are giving it so much importance. And there's this interesting quote by the translator Charles Wilkin where he, I think, says that it's a way to like the chains with which Indians have been sort of shackled, it sort of lightens the weight of those chains, by giving them a sense of self-worth, by valuing their culture, etc. But you must remember that, Indians had their own way of engaging with all of this. By the mid-19th century, the Gita also takes place on a battlefield. The Gita is also taking place where Arjuna is resistant to going to war against his cousins. And Krishna is basically telling him, you have to do your duty. Which means that in Indian hands, the valorization of the Gita actually becomes a way to stand up to British power. So the British valorize the Gita hoping to flatter the Indians. The Indians seize the same Gita to now start resisting the British. Saying that just as Arjuna had to do his dharma, despite the odds being against him, despite his own scruples, we will also learn to stand up to the British. And by the 20th century, far from making Indians feel like the shackles that the British had placed on them didn't matter, the Gita was being called the manual of the revolutionaries because actual Indian revolutionaries throwing bombs at Englishmen were walking around with the Gita. So that's one set of things that's happening. Another set of things, this man in this wonderful procession is Sarfoji of Tanjore, a Maratha king in Tamil country, second last rather, of that particular dynasty founded by Chhatrapati Shivaji's half-brother in Tanjore. This gentleman represents another impulse, which is a desire to learn. Now we would imagine that today a lot of revivalists or self-proclaimed custodians of Hindu pride often think that we must only look back at our scriptures, only look back at our traditions. But actual Hindu leaders, a prince in this case, of very elite background, very well educated, thought of it very differently. As much as he opened Vedic pathshalas, as much as he constructed and renovated temples, as much as he fed Brahmins and even gifted cows to Brahmins, not just Brahmins, occasionally Europeans would come and he'd give cows to them also, much to the European surprise. He was also very interested in Western learning, in the sense that he realized that we have a certain number of riches in our tradition, but the world has also moved. Which means there is a lot to learn. There is science, there is technology, there is chemistry, there is physics, there is modern mathematics. We need to learn this. The Puranas speak of the world as, I think 7 seas of butter and honey and milk and all of those multiple seas. He says, no, we should be teaching our children that there is only one sea and that sea is salty. There aren't seas of honey and sugar and milk. So he's very conscious and protective and respectful of his Hindu-ness. In that, as a Raja, he would patronize everything that Hindus value, including Sanskrit poets, etc. But at the same time, he also wants to synthesize Western learning into Indian languages. He himself knows English and French and German. He's managed to learn all of these languages. This is all early 19th century. More people should know about this man, but somehow we don't. And he's trying to synthesize Western learning. How does he do it? In Tamil Nadu, they have this play format called the Kuravanji, in which a fortune teller comes and speaks to the other protagonist, and they discuss things. And normally in a Kuravanji, it has a sacred geography. It will talk about Rameshwaram, Tirupati, the temple towns. He amends the Kuravanji and turns it into a geography lesson. So in his Devendra Kuravanji, the fortune teller comes and she's talking to Indra's wife, Indrani. Except they're not talking about Rameshwaram and Tirupati. Leaving aside Australia, they're talking about New York, they're talking about London, they're talking about Moscow, they're talking about Africa, they're talking about the rest of the world, because he wants children to learn about the rest of the world. You know, at the same time that the British, as I mentioned, they're trying to flatter Indians and they're actually sponsoring Sanskrit academies. So the British have set up a college in Banaras where they're teaching students about the 7 C's of milk and sugar and honey. And whereas Sarkoji is teaching this Indian Raja, he has picked up Western science and is teaching modern geography and modern mathematics, etc. to his students in his schools. The British are still figuring out, should we give them English, should we teach them in Sanskrit, should we teach them in Indian languages. Sarkoji is giving all. He's got Persian, he's got English, he's got Tamil, he's got Hindustani, he's got a bunch of languages that are available to his students in his school. Because as an Indian, he realized that the only way we can move forward is if we also accept certain ideas from the West. It's not a wholesale conversion to Western ideas. We're not going to give up our cultural attributes, but we will synthesize these Western ideas into our own culture. This I've already spoken about, this whole business of evangelists coming in. Now, because the Christian missionaries have come in, and now slowly there's this whole movement in Britain to let more and more missionaries into India, there's a war taking place within the East India Company. The East India Company itself is not a single time. The East India Company is not a single entity, right? So the directors in London keep telling their people on the ground in India, look, we don't want territory, we don't want wars, please just trade and deliver us profits. The men on the ground are not listening, not least because it takes 6 months for news from London to reach her. So you write to London saying that, oh, I think there's going to be a war next week. And London, by the time London writes back saying, please, no war at 6 months. And by then the war is over, kingdoms have been annexed, treasures have been seized, and the people on the ground want these treasures. They are military men who see an incentive in engaging in warfare in India. So there's already a dissonance between what London is saying and what the colonial state here is actually doing. Men on the ground are doing. Now, men on the ground do not want missionaries to come here. But London is under pressure because Parliament is being bombarded with petitions saying that missionaries must be let into the country, that the natives have to be saved, they have to enjoy the light of Christianity and all of that. So there is this sort of war going on within the British establishment as to whether or not missionaries should be permitted into the country. 1813, the missionary camp wins a victory in the sense that, okay, missionaries are permitted, but local men have discretion to decide where, when, how, and if they misbehave, that is, if they upset local people, they can be expelled from those places. By the 1830s, the missionaries win another victory, whereas no permission is needed. Now you can go wholesale into India and do as you wish. The British state will not stand in your way. So you can see that now this is when Indians are starting to get aggravated and irritated. And of course, irritation is manifested in various ways. One text, for example, would claim, it would try to intellectually position Christianity. Now, Christianity is a real force for the Hindu. You have to come to terms with it and explain why this Christianity is here. And one rather comical explanation was that Hinduism had delivered such joy and happiness and salvation to all the people in India that heaven was overpopulated because all the souls were going to heaven, and hell had been depopulated because there's nobody in hell now because Hinduism was doing so well. And this was upsetting the cosmic balance. So to restore cosmic balance, Vishnu or Shiva or some major Indian deity essentially created Christianity to waylay Hindus into following another false religion and going to hell. And this is a template, by the way, that's been used before. When Shaivas and Vaishnavas, long before used to feud, they used to make arguments like this against each other, which is that, oh, Vishnu has been so great to everybody that everyone is in heaven. So Shaivism was invented to put people in hell. So you have this template appearing earlier. Here it's turned around and used to, on the one hand, it gives space for Christianity in the worldview of the Orthodox Hindu, but it also gives it negative space. It also says that we are accepting that you are a phenomenon we have to deal with, but in a bad way. Another way in which some of the resistance manifests is these Ram Leela, performances, where you have the final thing where an arrow is shot at Ravana's effigy and it goes up in flames. Except now in a lot of North Indian Ram Leela performances, you find that Ravana was dressed in the clothes of the English Governor General. So without you don't have the power to stand up to the British, but you can make small little, arguments like this. Great debates are happening. People are meeting on the streets, they're coming face to face with missionaries and arguing back. Very much like in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut, when the Zamorin said, if Jesus was really divine, how could he have gone up on the cross? Similarly, people will say, we don't accept the idea of the Virgin Mary. That's not possible. There was a lot of debating taking place. And here in Bombay, there were some major scenes, like 1,000 people would gather by the sea, and there'd be these public debates between missionaries and Hindu speakers, and that sort of thing was also happening. So what you sense is this is a society in crisis. What it basically faced is British power. So the state is the white man's state. That state is increasingly looking evangelical. It is increasingly sympathetic to missionaries. Missionaries, as we saw in that picture, are now preaching outside melas, they're preaching outside temples, and they're backed clearly by the state. The state is no longer standing in their way. So those earlier Brahmins that we saw blessing the flag were no longer blessing the flag of the British East India Company either, because now the terms of engagement were shifting in favor of the white man and in favor of Christianity. This crisis results in different kinds of responses. In the book, I highlight three. The man on your left, the profile picture is of course Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Here at Sarmaya, they have the original volume of this book where this picture appears in color. His response was an intellectual response. Firstly, as a young man, Ram Mohan Roy seemed to reject the idea of religion itself. He thought, yes, there was God, but if different religions were prescribing different kinds of customs and ideas, clearly these religions are all man-made. So religion itself, to him, had little value. But then he realized that actually, politically, it does have value, and therefore Hinduism needs to be strengthened in order to stand up to pressures from the from the white man. So he actually says that Hindus in their present conditions are not able to politically stand for themselves, and he was therefore trying to resurrect Hinduism in a way that would make them meet the challenge of the missionaries in a confident sort of pose. So his Hinduism essentially takes the framework of the West. What is the framework of the West? Monotheism. So he says, yes, Hindus are monotheism. We also believe in a supreme God. Then they say, what about your temples? He said, that is all corruption. Just as the Christianity was corrupted by the Catholic Church and you had the Protestant Reformation, Hinduism was also corrupted over the centuries, and we are now reforming in order to come back with an authentic, pristine Hinduism. So he's using Western motives but applying it to Hinduism to mount an intellectual challenge. In fact, he goes so far as to say that Hindus have no reason to convert, because your idea of God still splits God into the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which means you're dividing God into three parts. Hindu Advaita Vedanta still says that God is an abstract entity beyond all shape and definition. So technically, logically, our sense is higher, so the Christian should convert to us rather than the other way around. So that's his intellectual argument. Then you have somebody like the gentleman on the right, like Dayananda Saraswati. Now, it's not only in engagement with white people that these debates are occurring. A lot of these debates are occurring within Hindu spaces automatically, because Hinduism is also dynamic. It's also a changing, shifting, evolving kind of tradition. Dayananda Saraswati's questions and questioning of traditional Hinduism does not come because he met a missionary. The story goes that as a young man for Shivaratri, he was up at night, as they do. And you have to stay up all night in a Shiva temple. And his father, of course, dozed off, as older men probably tend to do. But the young boy was very determined, and he was like, no, I'm going to stay awake. And somewhere in the middle of the night, he saw a mouse enter the sanctum of the deity and sort of feast on all the goods and the sweets and all the things that had been laid out before Shiva. And he basically says, well, if this is God, and God can't even defend himself from a rodent, clearly this isn't God. So that's where Dayananda's initial sort of doubts about traditional Hinduism appear. And then he starts wandering. He's wandering all over India, going up the Himalayas, looking for sadhus and sannyasis. At one point, he comes across a corpse. And he says, well, the Sanskrit books say that if you open the corpse, this is how it should be. So he actually opens up the corpse, discovers that what is inside the corpse does not match what the Sanskrit books say. So both the corpse and the books are dumped in the river. And that's that. He goes looking for these sannyasins, and most of them disappoint him. One sannyasi has a habit of speaking very hysterically and loudly in the middle of the night to strange, invisible beings, and he is not very convinced by this performance. He even tries bhang at one point, thinking that bhang will help him see something higher. Tantric texts will help him see something higher. Doesn't work. Finally comes across a guru and decides that Vedic revivalism, going back to the pure principles of the Vedas, monotheism, a very austere sense of religion, no temples, no idols, no puja, none of this is permitted. he comes into that mold of Hindu reform. So the Arya Samaj is essentially born out of this movement, which rejects idolatry. And again, here you see that the idea of idol worship is a big elephant in the room. They do not want idols, they do not want that kind of worship. But the most interesting to me is the gentleman in the middle, which is Jyotiba Phule. Phule, of course, is not just looking at Hinduism as an overall entity, he's looking at issues within Hinduism socially, most importantly, caste. So what he does is, just as Ram Mohan Roy takes these Western frameworks and turns it around and sort of deploys it against the white man, Phule appropriates the missionary criticism of Hinduism, of caste, of Puranic legends. For example, at one point, he says that Brahmins claim that they are superior in caste to all the other Hindus because they were born from the head of the cosmic creator. And Phule in his Marathi writing say, did the cosmic creator's head also contain a uterus? And if it contained a uterus, because clearly a baby was born from there, did the cosmic creator's head also menstruate? So very, very pungent, very, very direct. In fact, these were the kind of things missionaries said about Hinduism, except here he takes it and he attacks Hindu orthodoxy in order to develop reform within Hinduism against caste, etc. So you have three very different kinds of responses taking place. The Ram Mohan type of response is what Vivekananda again goes to America and delivers in his famous speech in the 1890s, where you're presenting a sanitized, cleaned up, esoteric, philosophical Hinduism to a Western audience, because now that Western audience matters and you need to mount an intellectual defense. Dayananda Saraswati wants a different kind of internal reform, which also becomes a very muscular kind of reform. Soon after he dies, by the time he dies, he already wants Hindu princes to come together, fight for Hindus. The cow becomes a very important thing. We think that people fighting over the cow is a present-day phenomenon. No, it began early 19th century. We already see it being used. Dayananda Saraswati uses it, and he uses the cow in a way to unite Hindus. His supporters in the Arya Samaj say that it doesn't matter what your caste is, what your background is, all of that is fine, but the cow is a unifying emblem, and we must stand up for the cow. And who eats the cow? The white man. So kind of muscular nationalism is born slowly from this Arya Samaj movement. And the Arya Samaj movement also learns other things from the missionaries. Just as missionaries in the Portuguese period would convert entire villages of pagans or Hindus, the Arya Samaj does the opposite. It would reconvert entire villages, thousands of people back to Hinduism from Islam and Christianity, mostly in Punjab and those parts. So it picks up a lot of missionary strategies. It starts establishing schools, because missionaries have schools. In the same temple, the Arya Samaj mounts its response. So there's a lot of that kind of change happening. And the final part of the story, which is Hindutva, where I end the book, and I don't go into the present and the subsequent ascendancy of Hindutva. But in this whole period, there are people asking the question, what is it that makes Hindus Hindu? My temple is different from your temple. I am a vegetarian, you're not. I am a Brahmin who cremates the dead, but there are other Brahmins who will bury their dead. What is it that makes us all one people? So there is the word Hindutva or Hindu-ness that needs to be defined in a very clear way. Different people try it in different ways. Tilak is the first one. He's a very aggressive nationalist. Nationalism is also bubbling up in this time. He's somebody who wants to Hinduize nationalism. He doesn't believe in the original Congress policy of nationalism as a debating society type of thing, where men come together and exchange ideas and petition the British state. He says, no, our religious ceremonies, our religious festivals should be turned into political platforms, and we can rouse Hindus to stand up to the British that way. Everybody knows that he develops the Ganapati and the Shivaji festivals partly in order to rouse people. And he says this quite openly, that we want our people to come together. If your caste is different, doesn't matter, you bring your Ganapati, I will bring my Ganapati. On the last day, we will all converge in a grand procession and we will make a show of our strength. So there's again that muscular nationalism that's emerging with Tilak. His Hindutva, though, is still defined in a very religious sense. So he says, as I said earlier, you must believe in multiple paths, you must believe in the Vedas, and he has a few other religious conditions. But the problem is that there are Hindus who do not believe in the Vedas. So if you look at Veerashaivism or the Lingayat tradition, to the extent that some argue that this is not even technically a Hindu sect, it's a completely different religion, their tradition rejects the Vedas. Cows, not all Hindus thought of the cow as sacred. There were Hindu castes that did eat beef. So it was very difficult to use religious principles to define Hindutva. And besides, Tilak himself, for all his aggression when it came to politics, when it came to social issues, he was a bit of a moderate. He didn't want caste to be removed. He didn't want women to go to school. He was a bit of an orthodox figure there. And with caste being there, it was very difficult to get Hindus to think of themselves as one block. Because why should a Brahmin cooperate with a Maratha when the two are at loggerheads in terms of caste? The man on the other side, V.D. Savarkar, he manages to conceptually go past this. Now, Savarkar was, of course, Tilak's protege. Tilak is the one who writes his recommendation letter for Savarkar to go abroad on a scholarship to England. Savarkar dedicates his first book to Tilak, so there's a lot of overlaps. Savarkar studies at Ferguson College, which was founded by Tilak, so they are in a sort of, preceptor-disciple kind of relationship. But Savarkar is also revolutionary. He's, throwing bombs, etc. As all of you know, he's eventually caught, sent off for several years to across the Kalapani to prison. Has a terrible time there because unlike Tilak, who was exiled to Burma, Tilak spent that time translating and writing a commentary on the Gita. It was a light kind of political punishment. He was imprisoned, but not beyond that. There was no harsh terms to his sentence. Savarkar actually had a harsh sentence. He had to do physical activities of a terrible nature. His weight collapsed by 12 kgs, etc., etc. But when he emerges from prison is when in the 1920s, in fact in his last year in prison is when he writes his famous book on Hindutva. And what is this sense of Hinduness? How does he define Hinduness? Conceptually, he achieves what Tilak had failed to achieve. He removes religion from the equation. He says to be defined as a Hindu, this has to be your ancestral land. So all your ancestors must be from this country. Fine, but then there's a problem that Christians and Muslims also have ancestors who are brown. What about them? So he says not just your ancestors, but your holy land must also be in India. So the places you venerate as holy must also be in India. On their own, these conditions are not enough. Both conditions have to be met. If it's only holy lands, or even Buddhists from China can come to India and claim that they are Hindus, that doesn't work. It has to be both. So you have to have descent from Indians and you have to have your holy land here. So what happens is Vaishnavas, Shaivas, Shaktas, those which are part of Hinduism are accepted, but others outside Hinduism are also accepted as Hindus. Sikhs, for example, Buddhists, Jains, they are accepted because they are Hindus in a political sense. He's framing Hinduism, the Hindu identity, not as a religious identity, but as a political identity. And he says anybody who has their holy places and descent is permitted. Who does it leave out? Christians and Muslims. Because they look to Mecca and Rome or Antioch or wherever it is, outside the subcontinent, that is where their holy lands lie. Therefore, these are the two groups that are excluded. So he's accepting that there are communities in this country, but the nation is Hindu, and the nation is Hindu defined this way. And this is where modern Hindutva ultimately emerges. Again, it's easier said than done. He theoretically sort of builds a framework for it. The reason this definition of Hindutva has lasted so long is that it is conceptually a way to really bring Hindus together as a political bloc. Yet it's not easy. Caste remains an issue. Savarkar himself tried very hard to get rid of caste. He gave the sacred thread to Dalits. He opened temples where all castes could worship. There was a lot of resistance to all of that. But he never really ultimately succeeded. And then you always need, the way Hindutva ultimately works itself is by building on an other, which is the idea of the Christian and the Muslim. But anyway, as my final point, I will present this image because the point of the book is not Hindutva, but the point of the book is the evolution of this Hindu identity. What you see essentially is before the arrival of the Portuguese, a fluid system. You have no reason to define yourself unless the context presents itself, right? If I'm sitting alone in a room, I don't have to call myself Manu because there's nobody else there. But if Pavitra enters the room and asks me who I am, that is when I need to give myself a name and explain who I am, and she explains who she is. So 4 brown men in a room have no reason to disagree, or they might even fight with each other because at that moment they're all part of the same ecosystem. But if a white man enters, suddenly there's a shift in the environment, right? They can clearly see that this person is distinct, and their own brownness becomes a way to articulate a kind of shared identity. They may still keep fighting, they may still keep sort of having their own internal issues, but the brownness becomes a thing. Suddenly it's a thing you can mobilize around. Something like that happened with Hinduism. In the pre-Islamic period, it had no reason to define itself a certain way. Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, the major sort of sects, did have something in common if you compare it with Buddhism and Jainism. So even in earlier literature, you find that there's a lot of animosity towards Jains. In Tamil Nadu, until recently, perhaps even now, in temple processions, they would carry these things that represented a Jain impaled on a stake, because there was violence also in the engagement of these groups with Jains and Buddhists at a certain time. But then you have Islamic power coming in first, and that hardens a sense of Hindu identity in the country. not because it's Islam. Islam came much earlier to South India and came completely in a very acceptable way through peaceful embassies of commerce. And people accepted it also. We have in Kerala, multiple legends linking mosques to temples, temple deities to Islamic traditions, etc. There's a lot of overlaps there. But in North India, when it acquires power, when it comes in also not just as a religion, but also as a political system, and then you have the age of the Sultans and the Mughals and all of that following, that is when you slowly start seeing a sense of Hindu identity emerging among people. And it's not just the Orthodox. If you look at the poetry of Kabir, Kabir in his poetry implicitly refers to Hindus and Turks as two separate groups. He uses these respective terms, which means automatically to him and to his audience, there was a bifurcation that there were two separate groups that he was addressing, and these two groups needed to be reconciled. Eknath here in Maharashtra, if you read his Barud, in which there's what's called the Hindu-Turk Samvad, they part as friends. Initially they debate each other, they're taking pot shots at each other's religion, but there is a clear Hindu and there is a clear Muslim, and these are considered two separate categories. So there is in the Islamic period a sense of the Hindu identity being born. But it is in the colonial period that this really sharpens itself for various reasons. One is technology. For the first time the country is unified under one power in this particular shape. You have the railways coming in, you have the printing press coming in. Earlier things didn't travel in the same way. Now things are traveling fast. People are able to read. Something being written by Tilak in Maharashtra is being read by people in Madras as well. There's a lot of movement, and technology allows people to come together. There is this interesting analogy, example that I often give from a book by Maria Mishra. She says that back in the day, for people to go from Calcutta to Puri, it would take weeks and weeks of walking. You had to trek all the way to Puri. But then the railways came, and initially the Hindus were very reluctant to accept the railways. They thought the fire carriage would, taint their caste, and it would be a horrible thing, and it was not for brown people to get on. Then they realized that the railways cut short the journey. You could get to Puri in a matter of hours, and the railway brought in by the British to support their army, to support their economic networks, actually ends up fueling the pilgrim network. Pilgrims start going in large numbers to Puri, and that Hindu identity acquires a certain flowering because of this technology coming into the picture. Something like that also happens. But essentially the reason I close with this image is, there is often the argument that's made that Hinduism was invented in the 19th century. And on the face of it, it makes sense, because the word Hinduism was first used by an 18th century man called Charles Grant in the 1780s or 90s. He's the one to first use that term. But just as I said, earlier Hindus had no reason to use a word like that for themselves. Already in the Islamic period, the word Hindu was coming around, but Hinduism is definitely a Western creation. But that doesn't mean the contents of Hinduism are a Western creation or an invention. It is a way of adapting and changing with time to survive contingencies of that time. And Hinduism has this strange capacity of wearing multiple faces. At different times, it has a different appearance. In different political contexts, it can take different faces. Just as I took these three men and their respective ways of looking at the Hindu identity vary. All are equally true, all are equally rooted in Indian culture, but each based on context, one addressing the West, one addressing fellow Hindus, one attempting to unite the Hindus in a political sense and not in an intellectual sense. Each of them came with their own responses. So too the Hindu identity is able to take multiple faces in different times. With that, I realize time is up. So thank you for listening to me. I hope it made sense. This is the first time I'm presenting this book.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.